I'll never apologize for the United States of America. Ever. I don't care what the facts are.
Why are we going to sit down and talk to these quote-unquote moderate rebels?
Who are the truly moderate rebels?
The search for the moderate rebel. Do these moderate rebels exist?
Moderate
rebels.
You are listening to Moderate Rebels. Right now, Max and I are with Ali Abunimah, who is the founder and editor of the Electronic Intifada, which is one of the most indispensable publications for anyone interested in news on Israel-Palestine. Ali is one of the most insightful journalists I know when it comes to the issue. Ali is also the author of One Country, which is one of the leading books looking at how a one-state solution could be possible in Israel-Palestine, articulating this very bold vision. So we have Ali here with us today to discuss, of course, many of the things happening recently with Trump declaring occupied Jerusalem as the supposed capital of Israel. We're also going to talk about Israelgate and how, this narrative of Russian collusion ultimately, in some ways, actually points to Israel, not to Russia.
Yeah, and Ali is, I think, the first patron we've had on our show.
Thank you, Ali.
Which should, encourage all of you to patronize us, because maybe you'll wind up as a moderate rebel guest. And Ben, maybe you can tell people how that's sarcasm. You're probably not gonna.
Yeah, we don't take bribes necessarily. It depends how big they are.
We don't offer a guesthood as a perk. But Ben, tell people how they can donate so they can hear more guests like Ali.
Well, I would say, it depends on how large the contribution is for being guest. But but for anyone who's interested in supporting our show, you can find our Patreon account at patreon.com/moderate rebels. And we also have some exclusive content that we post on there, some shorter episodes and such that you'll only have access to as a patron. So if you could support us, that'd be great. So Max, do you want to start off our conversation?
Well, I think it's been about a week since Trump's announcement, when Mike Pence pledged that the U.S. would consider recognizing Jerusalem as the capital of Israel and moving the embassy there. I actually thought it was just, more rhetoric, because, Trump had signaled that he'd do this months ago, and now he's finally done it. Ali, I guess just looking back at the announcement, why do you think Trump did this? And so far, just looking at the situation on the ground, what's changed on the ground?
Well, first, gentlemen, it's my pleasure to be on your esteemed podcast. I'm a long-time listener and first-time caller, and I'm a great fan of the frenetic NPR jazz.
Well, thank you. I actually wrote the music too, so that's great to hear.
I'm hoping that this interview will be surrounded on all sides by NPR-esque jazz.
I'll make sure to add a lot.
Let's get a little. Can we get a hit, Ben?
All right. Here's another weird composition I wrote.
Okay.
Of course. Well, so to get to the Jerusalem issue. Well, it's interesting now that we have the perspective of a week or so, which is like an eternity in politics these days, to see what, Trump did and didn't announce, because some of the absurdity of it is starting to show and how ill thought out it was. So Trump announced that that he recognizes, or the U.S. recognizes Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. And he announced that the embassy will be moved, but at the same time, they put out signals that, the embassy move is going to take a really long time. It's going to take years to plan it. Nothing is really going to change immediately. And, they could have, if they wanted to make it immediate, they could have relabeled the U.S. consulate in Jerusalem as the embassy, or made some other gesture to show that this was real, but they didn't. And what I mean by the absurdity is that a couple of days ago, late last week, there was this State Department briefing where the State Department officials couldn't answer the question of what country Jerusalem is in.
Right.
So they had this talk about, Jerusalem, you're saying Jerusalem is the capital of Israel, but is it in the country of Israel? And they wouldn't answer it because they said, well, our announcement doesn't take any position on final issues like borders and boundaries and so on.
Here's a clip from that hilarious press briefing, which was on December 7th. Speaking will be the acting assistant secretary for Near East Affairs, David Satterfield.
I've got what are going to sound like a couple softballs, but they were questions that your predecessors and others' predecessors weren't able to answer very easily. So just bear with me, the two very brief ones. What is the capital of Israel?
The president announced yesterday, issued a proclamation declaring the United States recognizes Jerusalem as the capital of the state of Israel.
So the answer to the question is Jerusalem, correct?
That's exactly right.
What country is Jerusalem in?
The president recognized Jerusalem as the capital of the state of Israel.
Does that mean then that the U.S. government officially recognizes that Jerusalem, the municipality, lies within the state of Israel?
There has been no change in our policy with respect to consular practice or passport issuance at this time.
So we have this absurd situation of recognizing Jerusalem as the capital of a country without being able to say what country Jerusalem is in. And this is playing out further with Mike Pence's upcoming visit, where, he's going to, as all American politicians do, they go to the Western Wall and do a photo op there. And the practice has been that when U.S. Officials go, they're not accompanied by Israeli government officials because, again, in keeping with the notion that the U.S. doesn't recognize Israeli sovereignty in Jerusalem. And so now the question is Mike Pence going to be accompanied by U.S. officials? I mean, in the grand scheme of things, given the brutal oppression that Palestinians face in Jerusalem, it's a minor issue, but it just shows kind of how ill thought out and absurd the whole thing is.
Yeah, and Trump pledged to find architects and contractors who will construct the embassy. But has any land even been allotted for the construction of an embassy? And would it possibly take place in a future Democratic administration that would invalidate Trump's decision?
Well, Democrats don't have a good record of, I'm not telling you anything you don't know. They don't have a good record of standing up on Israel. This is the one truly bipartisan issue.
And of course, many prominent Democratic leaders, including, members of the supposed resistance like Chuck Schumer, actually applauded Trump and encouraged him to say that Jerusalem is the capital of Israel. So on this particular issue, not only is there a kind of uniformity, but you actually have Democrats who are crossing party lines and encouraging Trump to do this.
Yeah, and that's what, a question Max asked is, why is Trump doing this now? And, that's an interesting question because one conventional answer, which, I think has a lot of truth to it, is that he is pandering to his, far-right Christian Zionist base, which is a solid part of the 32 or 33% of Americans who support him. And this has been a long time concern for the Christian evangelical right, who hope that, recognizing Jerusalem and all of that will hasten the arrival of the apocalypse. So there's that on the one hand. On the other hand, it's one of those moves like, launching cruise missiles at Syria that can get you plaudits from, both sides of the aisle. And the support from Chuck Schumer and other prominent Democrats is certainly an example of that.
Yeah, we had Bill Clinton attacking George H.W. Bush in the 92 campaign over his refusal to recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. But 4 years later, when Congress passed the Jerusalem Embassy Act, basically in bipartisan fashion, calling for relocating the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, Bill Clinton opposed it. And you've seen this kind of pattern. Barack Obama in 2008, his speech at AIPAC, which was authored by Dennis Ross, apparently, who's now kind of like a de facto lobbyist for Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia, calling for Jerusalem to be the undivided capital of Israel. Then Barack Obama, as president, goes back on it. So, Trump is the first president to actually, really shift the goalposts in a concrete way. So, I mean, there is a difference. I think the Democrats are wedded to the model, the outmoded model of a two-state solution and the peace process, which, with the understanding inside AIPAC and inside the Israeli military intelligence apparatus, the Israeli political establishment, which is now Likud, that this endless process, as long as there is no, as long as there are no final arrangements or maps produced, will provide Israel with the perfect pretext for creating new facts on the ground while claiming that it wants peace and it just doesn't have a partner on the other side. So that's all been kind of exposed. I mean, how do you think this is going to affect dynamics? First of all, I think I would want to ask, how would this affect dynamics within the Democratic Party when you see, the base of the Democratic Party really moving away from the pro-Israel consensus? For the first time, we have Pew polls showing that self-identified liberal Democrats do not support Israel over Palestine. That's particularly true for the 18 to 35 set. And Democrats can no longer claim to support a two-state solution. I mean, it seems to be over. So how will that shift, politics, and will that provide an avenue for people who've been kind of throwing rocks outside the building, who've been on the outside, in the Palestine solidarity movement, to actually apply pressure within? I mean, we've also seen in recent weeks statements from 35 House Democrats in support of Issa Amro, the Palestinian human rights defender in Hebron. So, do you think this will actually have any meaningful impact within the Democratic Party, at least the self-identified progressive wing?
Yeah, let me talk first about the two-state solution thing before getting to the Democratic Party, because what we saw today, when you say the Democratic Party, I let me extend that to kind of centrist elites across the Atlantic as well. Because on the day we're talking today, Benjamin Netanyahu just visited the EU headquarters in Brussels, where he received this, very cordial welcome. But there was this supposed public spat between him and the EU Foreign Policy Chief Federica Mogherini, where Netanyahu said, we expect that everyone will recognize the reality that Jerusalem is the capital of Israel, in his very kind of arrogant way. I hope you like the little impression there.
Yeah, I like it a lot.
It's hard to impersonate Netanyahu because he kind of speaks like an American, and
it's almost like he is an American.
He makes Derek Jeter jokes.
I grew up in the United States. I know the United States like the back of my hand, and I used to sleep in Jared Kushner's bedroom.
And my family's real name is Milikovsky, and I changed it to Netanyahu and claimed that I have a 3,000-year-old connection to Jerusalem because I found a ring in a pawn shop in Jerusalem that says Netanyahu, which actually just means he was here. So I basically
we digress.
I think we've gotten away from our little talking points.
Well, and also a quick note, you mentioned his visit, Netanyahu's visit to the EU. We also, a few weeks ago, did an episode with Asa Winstanley, who's an excellent reporter also at the Electronic Intifada, and we discussed the Labour Party in the UK. And of course, the Blairite neoliberal wing of the party is just like the Democrats. So, I mean, you're certainly right in the sense that this is definitely transatlantic.
Right. Well, but what I wanted to say about the meeting at the EU in brief is that, Federica Mogherini, the EU foreign policy chief, repeated in zombie-like manner the mantra of, the only solution is the two-state solution, blah, blah, blah. I made a joke on Twitter. I don't know how funny it is, but, it's like the Alexa. You could get a Federica, which you ask any question, and it will always give you the same mantra about the two-state solution. And my point is that I think that it is hard to overstate the resilience of the zombie peace process narrative. These elites will continue to repeat this mantra in the face of all the most glaring facts. So it really is going to have to come from the grassroots to change this dead zombie two-state solution discourse. And there, what's going on in Europe, in the Labour Party, and in the Democratic Party is significant. And for example, there was a poll, I think, a University of Maryland poll in May. I don't have it in front of me, but I as I remember, the finding was that 2 in 5 Americans now support sanctions or stronger action on Israel because of its settlements, and that rose to 56% among self-identified Democrats. So a majority of Democrats would support sanctions or stronger measures. And you find similar polls in Canada, in Australia, in the UK, wherever it is, you find similar sentiments among subgroups in these countries as well. And this shift is generational. It's particularly strong, as Max mentioned, in the millennial age group. And I think it is bearing fruit. You see, for example, in 2014, there's this famous or notorious YouTube video clip of Elizabeth Warren literally running away when someone asked her a question about the massacre Israel was perpetrating in Gaza in 2014. She literally turns tail and runs away. And more recently, though, she's been willing, she's not taking strong, courageous positions, but she recently came out publicly against the Israel Anti-Boycott Act. And she recently signed a letter. It wasn't a great letter, but it was a letter with 9 other Democratic senators calling on Israel not to demolish the Palestinian village of Susia in the occupied West Bank. And I attribute this not to the courage of any of these politicians, but to them being forced to listen to the grassroots base and respond to it. And then another significant development we've had just in the past couple of weeks is Representative Betty McCollum in Minnesota, who introduced a bill. It doesn't have a very snappy name, so I don't remember the name of the bill, but the contents of the bill is what's important. It is the first bill ever in U.S. history that focuses on Palestinian rights, and particularly it prohibits the use of U.S. military aid for the military detention, abuse, and torture of Palestinian children. This is a big problem. More than 700 Palestinian children a year are subjected to Israeli military detention, including abuse and torture.
Just, having been in the children's court at Ofar military prison, which is a Israeli military prison in occupied Palestinian territory, you witness these trials where they bring in children, which are, Palestinians usually under 18, but sometimes as young as 13. They're completely chained. They're wearing like a surplus UPS uniform, which has been supplied somehow, or an American surplus military uniform. And they're put in the dock, and they're subjected to these endless tribunals where they're not even sentenced, and they usually wind up spending about 6 months in jail before they're let out. And the point of them being jailed is that they're they're usually kidnapped out of their beds or arrested in the street and accused of throwing stones, but they're often kidnapped and subjected to kind of interrogation sessions where they're supposed to give up, various resistance plots or plots to stage popular protests so that the Israeli military can go in and arrest the adults. They're kind of used as collateral. So it's a really draconian and obviously, illegal under international law, the procedure and the whole apparatus. But it shows you how at its base, the Israeli occupation relies in so many ways on the detention and interrogation of children. So my understanding was that this resolution, which was introduced by Betty McCollum, or this bill, was really the product of years of work by people in the Palestine Solidarity Movement, people from American Friends Service Committee in Chicago, and others.
That's exactly right. And that was the next point I wanted to make, is that this was the fruit of a grassroots campaign over 3 years, a campaign in particular called No Way to Treat a Child, that involved people all over the country, was led by American Friends Service Committee and Defense for Children International. And what it goes to show, and it involved a number of steps, of educating lawmakers, of, groups of citizens meeting with them, of, holding sessions on Capitol Hill and so on, to the point where they introduced this legislation. And, I don't think anyone is under the illusion that Congress is about to pass this bill. That's not the most important point right now. I think what is significant is that now there is a piece of legislation that's got 10 co-sponsors, and people who want to get organized and get active can actually have a focus to go to their legislators and say, we want you to co-sponsor this bill. And I think that this whole process of the No Way to Treat a Child campaign actually changed my mind about the utility of even lobbying Congress or advocating Congress. I think I had, written it off as a waste of time. And I think, this has changed my mind. There is value in it. This is a very good bill. And it's also a good vehicle to engage and mobilize people and start to challenge the complicity within the U.S. political system, and particularly within the Democratic Party.
You've been a relentless critic not only of the Democratic Party and the EU and Israel, these European neoliberal elements, which are basically supplying oil to the occupation machine by clasping hands with Netanyahu, but also the Palestinian Authority. And, the Palestinian Authority is, the occupation subcontractor, which has really played a pernicious role in the West Bank in crushing the Palestinian national struggle, in my view, and particularly in crushing Palestinian resistance. It's kind of started in 2007 when General Keith Dayton, under the watch of Tony Blair, came in and trained the Palestinian Authority. The process started earlier, but trained the Palestinian Authority security forces to basically enforce the occupation within Area A, which are the core Palestinian cities in the West Bank, and then basically hand over areas B and C to the Israeli military, which put the whole rural Palestinian population, under the boot of the Israeli military, and resistance was crushed. I think the last iteration of resistance that was crushed was, directly under the guidance of Salam Fayyad and his security forces in the Balata refugee camp outside Nablus, which put up the fiercest resistance to Israel during the Second Intifada. So now you're kind of in a situation where Palestinians are defenseless. They've basically been disarmed. They have no deterrence capacity. And what the promise of the PA was that the Palestinians would get something in return for this. They'd get it, if not an economic peace, they'd get a state. And instead of getting a state, what they've gotten is Jerusalem has been declared the capital of Israel. The Al-Aqsa compound is under constant threat from settlers. And, the economic situation is absolutely abysmal. And then you have Gaza, which is completely cut off and under siege, getting 4 to 6 hours of electricity a day. So where does this put the PA, and, what kind of, levers can be applied to, to shift the balance on the ground? What does this mean for Palestinian resistance inside Palestine?
Well, the first thing is just on a historical note. Of course, the role of the PA, the Palestinian Authority, as Israel's subcontractor was built in from the very beginning. It didn't start in 2007. You could say it entered a new phase in 2007, but it was there right from the beginning. The whole structure of the PA was designed to provide security to Israel. And back in the late 90s, I think it was in 96 or 97, when Yasser Arafat introduced military tribunals to try Palestinians without any basic protections in furtherance of this goal of securing Israel. Then Vice President Al Gore publicly praised the military tribunals of the Palestinian Authority. So this was always the plan. And, Arafat was vilified and demonized by Israel and to a certain extent by the U.S., not for, defying the United States and Israel, but for being insufficiently compliant with them, even though he had, complied with, 90% of their requests. It wasn't until Mahmoud Abbas came along that, they found someone to comply with 98%, and there's still 2% that they need someone, to enforce on the Palestinians, someone to sign a final surrender. And, the demonization of Mahmoud Abbas is because of that. It's, the claims that he's inciting Palestinians and so on is all BS. Am I allowed to say that on NPR?
We encourage it.
On psychedelic NPR.
Right.
You're not allowed to criticize Abbas on NPR. That's the main thing.
That's right, yeah. But so that's the position the PA is in, that they have always been... and by the way, that's why, you get these constant threats from... the over-enthusiastic pro-Israel lawmakers in Washington to cut off funding to the Palestinian Authority. And it hasn't happened until now, because really what happens is the Israel lobby steps in and explains to these, enthusiastic young lawmakers that aid to the PA is aid to Israel, because this aid is used. And in fact, there was even, one of these funding rounds when Obama was still president, where he even made the argument, to get Congress to approve this aid, that aid to the PA is important because it helps protect Israeli settlers in the West Bank. So in that context, the PA is entirely powerless, and its declarations and rhetoric about Jerusalem is simply for cover. Remember that it was Saeb Erekat, the chief negotiator for life of the Palestinian Authority, who, as was revealed by the Palestine Papers in 2011, had promised Israel
the biggest Yerushalayim.
The biggest Yerushalayim in history. That was his term, meaning that, basically Israel would be able to annex virtually all of its settlements in and around Jerusalem. So who is the PA to now, whine and cry about what Trump is doing when they had been ready to give away, almost the whole shop?
I wanted to just, talk about Jerusalem just as a city for a second. First of all, the Palestinians it's always said that the Palestinians have been offered East Jerusalem. But what they've really been offered is Abu Dis, which is partially a garbage dump. I mean, no offense to the good people of Abu Dis, but, Israel maintains a garbage dump there, and it's a very small town. It's not really East Jerusalem. When you talk about East Jerusalem, you're talking about Sheikh Jarrah. You're talking about, the core neighborhood. So there's this Abu Dis plan. And then you look at the whole city. It is already a city that is bisected by the separation wall, and it's not clear what would be there for Palestinians in the first place. I wrote in Goliath, my book, about Kufar Aqab, which is this area that's technically considered East Jerusalem, but it's on the other side of the separation wall. And so its Palestinian residents pay taxes to the Jerusalem municipality, but receive no services because the garbage trucks from Jerusalem, the police, the fire trucks can't get through the separation wall, and the Palestinian Authority is not allowed to enter Jerusalem, so they can't provide any services. So basically, they're totally on their own. They have to pick up their own trash. All the stoplights are broken. The streets don't get repaired. And the reason people live there is because they're largely couples who who have Palestinian Authority ID and Jerusalem ID, and it's the only place they can live because Israel bans them from living together. So you just have like this city that's already completely fragmented. And then you look at the whole history of the city. I mean, I saw this New York Times article yesterday about how, Jerusalem is just fraught with tension constantly and people are nervous about each other. There's no, discussion of the power dynamics or the history. But we know, and Ali, you've written extensively about this, that the New York Times Jerusalem Bureau is in a home that belonged to a very notable Palestinian family that was ethnically cleansed in 1948. Where is the discussion of what Jerusalem already is and how it would almost be impossible physically for a two-state solution at this point? I mean, where's the discussion of the power dynamics? Where's the discussion of 1948? I mean, we're still talking about 67 as if that's when history began here.
Well, that's been one of the striking things to me in the past week of intense media focus on Jerusalem is how little discussion there has been of the actual reality in Jerusalem and some basic facts. I mean, Netanyahu's assertion and Trump's assertion is that recognizing Jerusalem as the capital of Israel is simply recognizing reality. But what is the reality? The reality is that you have more than 200,000, somewhere between 200,000 and 300,000 Palestinians in occupied East Jerusalem. And since 1967, Israel has been basically trying to erase the Palestinian character and identity of this city through systematically closing down Palestinian organizations, civic society, institutions, cultural organizations, and so on. Expelling people through revocation of residency rights. Remember, Palestinians didn't come to Israel. The occupation came to them. But Israel treats Palestinian Jerusalemites like permanent residents who, just came to the city to live as migrants, and who, if they leave, like if you're a Jerusalemite and you go abroad to study, to travel, to work, to get married, Israel says, oh, you've left, and they revoke your residency. You have no right to come back to the city you were born in. Of course, that doesn't apply to Jews and Israelis. Jewish settlers can come from all around the world and come and go as they please. The home demolitions, and in fact, right at the beginning of the occupation, what's the big picture here? At the beginning of the occupation, the municipal authorities of the occupation had actually set a numeric quota that they were not going to allow the Palestinian population of what they call Greater Jerusalem, the Israelis expanded the boundaries, to exceed 27%. So they had actually set a racial quota that in order to gerrymander through ethnic cleansing and violence, a Jewish majority, they were going to set the Palestinian population at 27% and do everything possible to make Jerusalem an inhospitable place for them. That's why the roads and other services are non-existent, because they don't want Palestinians to be able to live in the city. That's why there are thousands of children in Jerusalem who don't have school places because they don't build enough classrooms. They don't want Palestinian children to have schools in Jerusalem because they don't want them to stay. And then when you look at the numbers, according to B'Tselem, the Israeli human rights group, Israel has revoked 14,500 residency cards since 1967. Well, that might not sound like much, but the impact is much bigger than the numbers sound, because they may simply revoke the residency of one person in the family. It might be the head of the household. Well, that forces the whole family out, because the family then has to decide whether to live apart, to be split up with some members in Jerusalem and others outside, and they can't even see each other because of all the walls, or the whole family has to leave. That's how it's done. So you have to multiply that 14,500 by however many people are in those people's families. And that's the reality in Jerusalem that no one is talking about. Jerusalem is not just a symbol. It is a living city that is being deliberately killed by Israel. And on the other side, one thing that, we've talked about often is the bubble that the Western media live in and don't see this reality. They all live in West Jerusalem, which was ethnically cleansed in 1948, by the way. And that's where the Karmi House is, where the New York Times has its bureau. But you wrote about this in an article that is just a classic for the Electronic Intifada in 2014. Candid video reveals New York Times bureau chief Judy Rudoran's Zionist bubble. And that article, that is a classic. But, you had found this video that the Rudorans, Jody Rudoran and husband, had put up on YouTube, I think not intending necessarily for it to be public, just depicting their totally privileged, oblivious life in Jerusalem, in West Jerusalem, that just sums up kind of the whole isolation that that people like her and many Western observers have, that shields them from the realities Palestinians face.
Yeah. And in that video, she's sitting with Abraham Foxman, who is the national director of the Anti-Defamation League, the ADL, this ostensible, supposedly left-leaning civil rights organization that is actually just a pro-Israel lobby group.
Yeah. They're sitting there complaining that the Hotel Essex, which is by Central Park, Abe Foxman is literally complaining to the New York Times Jerusalem bureau chief that the Essex Hotel was bought by Qatar and that there used to be Jewish weddings there, but in his words, the Arabs have taken it over, and she's guffawing with him and then refers to Abe Foxman as her personal defamation protector. But this video is just emblematic of the whole culture of the way that Jerusalem is covered by the international press corps, particularly, the more established American elements. Jody Rudoran's husband, Gary, was this humorist. Well, first of all, her real name, her maiden name was Will Gorin, and his name was Rudin, I think. And they combined their names, which, is a quirky thing that couples do. But then they also go around West Jerusalem, apparently making videos for one another and posting them on YouTube, sort of showing their lives in Jerusalem. I think Gary Rudoran wanted to show his friends back in the States how they were living, and it just showed that they were in this all-Jewish bubble where they hung out with people like Sarah Silverman's sister, who's this liberal rabbi who lives in an ethnically cleansed Palestinian home in West Jerusalem. And the only Palestinian that Gary Rudoran meets while he's kind of, walking around Jerusalem, cracking little jokes, is the guy who washes their clothes. And he says, well, there are lots of Arabs in Jerusalem, after he hands his dirty laundry to a guy and then walks away. And this really, this exposed what was really at the base of Jody Rudoran's coverage. Why, she complained after she was in Gaza during the military escalation of Israel in 2012, that she missed her Zumba class in Jerusalem. So she walked up and down the stairs of a home that had been bombed by Israeli jets, an abandoned home. And that's how she got her exercise. The cultural obliviousness is really playing out in so many ways whenever there's a crisis. And I think you can see it in the kind of both sides-y coverage and the understanding of Jerusalem, as Ali pointed out, as sort of just a symbol for Palestinians and not a living, breathing city that's being killed. So there it is. I think, let's maybe shift towards kind of the geopolitical situation. I think we've seen the mask lift in a lot of ways, especially on Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, I think what's interesting about this, we were talking about the PA and collaborators, if you will, with the occupation and with Israel as a state overall. And Israel's Channel 10 News reported that Saudi Arabia and Egypt both gave President Trump, the green light to recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. And we've seen in the past few months, the mask has been lifted, and we see that Saudi Arabia is really openly collaborating with Israel. This isn't new, of course. It's been an open secret for many years, but particularly in their joint opposition to Iran. We saw this in the war in Syria, where Israel has launched more than 100 attacks on the Syrian government and Hezbollah. So we see this political coordination and this alliance that has become more and more clear. And I think kind of the apotheosis of this is the fact that Saudi Arabia really did nothing to stop President Trump or pressure him in any way. So can you comment overall what you think, Ali, about the role of Gulf states in all of this, particularly Saudi Arabia and also the UAE? I mean, it seems very clear that although in the past they maintained this pretense and discursively they claim to support Palestinians, that time has long passed, if it ever really did exist. And of course, Ghassan Kanafani's famous story, Men in the Sun, is precisely about this portrayal. And the PFLP had also maintained ideologically that the enemy was not just Israel, but what they called the reactionary Arab regimes, the Gulf states, which are wedded to Western imperialism. So can you talk about the role of the Khalij, the Gulf, in all of this, and just how utterly it has betrayed the Palestinians?
Well, the bigger context for what happened with Jerusalem in the past week or so is, as you point out, the rapprochement between the Gulf states and other Arab states, because there's also Egypt and Jordan who, have long-standing peace treaties and close ties and complicity with Israel. But in particular, Saudi Arabia, the sort of secret under the table ties have been coming out into the open. And this has been happening with more and more, kind of shamelessness. So over the past couple of years, there were sort of public signs of this with meetings between, former senior Israeli officials and former senior Saudi officials. There's a Saudi general, Eshki, who led delegations to Israel. Turki al-Faisal, a very senior prince, had public meetings with, various top Israelis, including at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, which is the premier Israel lobby think tank tied to AIPAC, the UAE as well.
Yeah, I actually saw Saudi Prince Turki bin Faisal speak at a neoconservative conference organized in New York in September at the Roosevelt Hotel that was put on by the group UANI, United Against Nuclear Iran, which is a super right-wing neoconservative group that has been lobbying incessantly against the Iran deal, to impose more sanctions, and really to declare war on Iran. And bin Faisal was actually speaking on stage with former CIA director David Petraeus, who just did an event before that with the arch neocon Max Boot. And then also at this UANI conference were a slew of other, far-right hyper-imperialist people like John Bolton, of the Iraq war ilk. And they were all unified in their opposition to Iran.
That gives you a sense of what this is all about, is that, in their conception, the real enemy is Iran. And this is often stated in very sectarian terms. This so-called phrase attributed to the king of Jordan of a Shia crescent. So it's you'd have to talk about a Jewish crescent or something to understand just how frighteningly sectarian and racist that is. So, it's this. So that's the framework here, is that they want to escalate things with Iran, and they look at the whole the region through that lens of confrontation and pushing for war with Iran, when Iran has, actively pursued, I guess you could call it détente, through the Iran nuclear deal. The US and Iran have tacitly worked closely in Iraq and so on. But the interpretation that they have is Iran is the aggressor. And the rapprochement we've seen is not just Saudi Arabia, as mentioned, the UAE. We've seen the UAE buy military technologies from Israel. For example, this Pegasus system that is used to spy on people via their smartphones, and the emails that have been leaked to various media outlets from the UAE ambassador in Washington show high-level coordination with various Israel lobby groups. And Bahrain recently, the Crown Prince of Bahrain attended this big public ceremony at the Simon Wiesenthal Institute in Los Angeles, one of the most virulent anti-Palestinian organizations in the country. And that was returned this, just this week with a public delegation of notables from Bahrain visiting Israel. So that is all sending the signal of normalization with Israel. I mean, other countries will look around the world and say, well, if all the Arab states are doing it, why shouldn't we? And I think that's exactly the signal it's sending and perhaps intended to send, despite the public claims that these countries oppose recognizing Jerusalem. Actions speak louder than words.
And that follows these countries. I mean, the Gulf countries and the U.S. and Israel kind of getting, punched back pretty hard in Syria. It also resulted in the failed removal of Saad Hariri in Lebanon. And it just doesn't seem like, while this alliance is deepening, it doesn't seem like they've thought things through very well in the Middle East.
And of course, remember the disaster they suffered in Yemen, where they had turned Ali Abdullah Saleh, the former president who was fighting with the Houthis, against the Saudi-led coalition, and they had bought him over to their side for, goodness knows how much money, and within 3 days he was killed. So these schemes, these regional schemes are not working as planned, but they are still nevertheless incredibly damaging and able to cause great chaos and suffering.
Well, I also think it's a reflection overall of the decline of U.S. power, not just in the region, but globally. And we've seen, this kind of institutional crisis that's emerged. Of course, it led to people like Trump, and it's going to get worse, unfortunately. But when we look at the region, I mean, of course, Saudi Arabia and Israel are key proxies of the U.S. And you look at all of these wars. I mean, the war in Iraq, of course, it was criminal. It also was a complete disaster. I mean, it was a legal invasion followed by, a decade of military occupation that led to the rise of extremism, eventually to ISIS. And then it's also true that Iran has a much closer relationship with the current Iraqi government than the U.S. does. And of course, you look in the war in Syria.
There's something there that, there is a decline of U.S. power, relatively speaking. But I think that U.S. power has always been overstated or overestimated. And the Iraq War is a good example of that, because in a sense, that represented the height of U.S. power, peak U.S. imperialism when George Bush ordered the invasion of Iraq and the regime change there. But all that U.S. power was not able to achieve what the fantasies of the Americans had conjured up. Remember the plans that Iraq was going to be this, docile, U.S.-friendly, corporate-friendly country where they would use it as a laboratory for all their fantasies that they wanted to inflict later on the United States, like, flat taxes and deregulation and all this. And none of that happened. And, if anything, it was the other countries in the region and other countries in the world that, reaped whatever spoils came out of the horrific crime that was the invasion of Iraq. And so in so many ways, and this is also true in so many other parts of the world is U.S. schemes almost never go the way they're supposed to.
Well, and of course, General Wesley Clark also exposed that the Bush administration had planned to topple 7 countries in 5 years. Iraq was just the first. And we saw that, the disaster of that prevented future wars. Although at the same time, some of the other countries on that list, like Syria and Libya, have also been through horrific wars. In the case of Libya, there is no functioning central government. After in 2011, NATO destroyed the Libyan state and brought, the slave markets that we see now. So, I do agree in the sense that the U.S. military can't just force all of these states to be compliant, but it can just smash them. And Libya is an example of it.
Oh, absolutely. I'm not in any way arguing that the results of U.S. policy aren't catastrophic. I'm just saying that they don't go the way they're supposed to.
Oh, for sure.
It turned out that the Heritage Foundation interns couldn't run Baghdad. And that was the Bush administration's calculation. So, you can draw a straight line from that to Jared Kushner being appointed as the Trump administration's fixer on the Middle East. This guy's, he's barely qualified to have a bar mitzvah. And I think we heard him speak for maybe the second or third time at the Brookings Institute Saban Center, named for Haim Saban, the Israeli-American oligarch who has been one of the leading individual donors to the Clinton empire, from Bill Clinton to Hillary Clinton's campaigns to the Clinton Foundation. His money has paid for the construction of the Democratic National Committee headquarters down the street from where I'm at. Haim Saban is someone who's identified with the Democratic Party, but he is also someone who said, I'm a one-issue guy, and my issue is Israel. And so he hosted Jared Kushner for a reason, which is that the pro-Israel lobby has been banking on Kushner, thanks to his family's long and deep ties to the Likud party and Benjamin Netanyahu, as kind of, to guarantee that the Trump administration would move the goalposts in a more, settler colonial direction. And I think it's really the Kushner connection that helps explain the Jerusalem decision, along with the other assortment of oligarchs that are within the kind of pro-Likud constellation. Sheldon Adelson, Bernard Marcus, the CEO of Home Depot, Paul Singer. These 3 contributed over $40 million to Trump's presidential campaign through super PACs, and they've been lobbying not just for the Jerusalem as a capital, but also for tearing up the Iran deal and even war on Iran. So you got Jared Kushner and Haim Saban sitting on stage at the Brookings Institute. Jared Kushner's he's kind of nervous looking. He always looks really nervous in public, he's just an agoraphobe. And he's kind of sweating and perspiring. And he's sitting there, and Haim Saban, is really garrulous. He has leather ceilings at his home in Beverly Hills. He's just kind of a flamboyant character. And he openly thanks Jared Kushner for colluding with Israel to undermine the diplomacy of a sitting American president, Barack Obama. And this was what was exposed in the indictment of former National Security Director Michael Flynn. And then Jared Kushner nervously says, "Thank you." So, I wonder if you two could just provide a little more color here and explain what happened when we saw the details of Michael Flynn's indictment, and what did it tell us about the U.S. special relationship with Israel, and where does Kushner, fit in to the overall discussion we've been having about Trump's moves in the Middle East? I would just ask Ali, fit this into the narrative of Russiagate. Why haven't we been hearing more about this really extraordinary episode?
Well, what was the old catchphrase from TV? Marsha, Marsha, Marsha. Well, yeah. It's supposed to be Russia, Russia, Russia. And that's the mantra on, MSNBC and, all the other mainstream outlets, CNN, that, of course, Max, you've done much to expose. You and others, Aaron Mate as well, has written about and talked about a lot on the Real News. And of course, and that's how they tried to spin the revelations from the Michael Flynn indictment or guilty plea. That this proved high-level collusion with Russia because he had lied about these two conversations with the Russian ambassador in December 2016 during the transition period to the Trump administration. And in fact, the details, of the filings, what the special counsel Robert Mueller filed in federal court, actually totally undermines the Russia collusion narrative, because the story that emerged from those documents is that Benjamin Netanyahu had asked, when you piece it together with all the other stuff that's come out, it boils down to this. Benjamin Netanyahu asked Jared Kushner to do everything he could to pressure and cajole other countries to vote against or delay or derail the UN Security Council resolution condemning Israel for its settlements that was passed last December. And what Jared Kushner did was to ask Michael Flynn to contact not just Russia, but every country on the UN Security Council on behalf of Israel to try and achieve this goal. So what it actually shows is Jared Kushner and Michael Flynn colluding with a foreign power, Israel, against the policy of the sitting administration, the Obama administration, which was to allow the resolution to pass, which is what eventually happened on December 23rd last year. In other words, Jared Kushner's scheme failed, but what was revealed was an effort to collude on behalf of Israel, not the other way around. It wasn't, Russia wasn't asking for anything. It was Israel asking, and Russia said no.
So it should be Israelgate.
It should be Israelgate, absolutely. But, and that was, and of course, Haim Saban had bankrolled the failed Hillary Clinton campaign to the tune of millions and millions of dollars. But he was very chummy up on that stage with Jared Kushner, exactly because, Democrat, Republican, all that pales into insignificance when it comes to Israel. Because, as you mentioned, Saban said, I'm a one-issue guy and my issue is Israel. So he was thanking, there have been suggestions, I don't know how serious they are, but nonetheless, there have been suggestions in the serious press that Kushner's collusion with Israel could have violated the Logan Act, because, this would be supposedly meddling in diplomacy without the authorization of the U.S. government. But potentially there is a crime there. And Saban was publicly thanking him for what was potentially illegal activity. As long as it's for Israel, it's okay.
And this is something you alluded to earlier. Jared Kushner's family is so close to Netanyahu that Netanyahu literally stayed in Jared Kushner's childhood bedroom when he was out in college. I mean, it's
no, he was in the basement.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
According to the New York Times, Jared moved to the basement.
Oh, okay. So that night he slept in the basement. But I mean, this is the ultimate visual metaphor for, just how close they actually are. And of course, Kushner is, has the ear of Trump himself. And another issue that is related to what you just said is that there even have been some reports highlighting the fact that Kushner did not disclose the fact that he was heading a family foundation that was funding illegal settlements in the occupied West Bank. So that itself is also likely illegal.
Including, I think it's the Oded Yosef Yeshiva, which is the radical yeshiva that is responsible for the production of the tract known as Torat HaMelech, which I'd covered previously. And this book was described by the Israeli newspaper Ma'ariv as a guide for when it is permissible to kill Gentiles. It was produced by two rabbis who are basically providing sort of guidelines for Israeli soldiers on when it's religiously permissible to commit genocide against Palestinians. The book calls for or declares that it's permissible to kill the children of Gentiles en masse if they are deemed to be a threat to the Jewish people. So it's a genocide manual. The two rabbis, Yitzhak Shapira and Yitzhak Ginsburg, were called in by the Israeli General Security Service, the Shin Bet, for interrogations, and they just simply said, no, we're not going to talk to you. Good night. And it's an extremely popular book within the religious nationalist core of the Israeli military, which now comprises over 40% of the officer corps. And the Kushner family donated to this yeshiva, which is just notorious. I mean, I think it's been recently defunded. It was funded by the Israeli Education Ministry, but that really shows you what the Kushner family was up to. I mean, they were funding the most contentious settlements, the ones that are not part of the, the blocks that are supposed to stay part of Israel in a future settlement. So this family was really out there, and Jared Kushner was the co-chair of the Kushner Family Foundation. And now he's supposed to be in charge of Middle East peace efforts.
Yeah, and on top of that, of course, you have David Friedman, the U.S. ambassador, who has donated millions and fundraised millions for these settlements and extremist training camps, I guess we could call them.
Right. David Friedman is the chair of American Friends of Bet El, which is a religious nationalist-oriented Israeli settlement. And, these are the figures that the Trump administration has chosen to manage the situation on the ground, in which, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman and, his counterpart in Abu Dhabi, Mohammed bin Zayed, are playing footsie with. I wouldn't even say playing footsie. I mean, it's like a full-on embrace, like a bare-chested embrace. So what's the future for the Palestinians? I mean, if you go back to 2014 and you look at how that really devastating war on Gaza developed, I mean, it started in the West Bank with the kidnapping of 3 Israeli teens, an official Israeli deception that led to this insane right-wing backlash in Jerusalem, which resulted in the burning alive of Mohammed Abu Khader, the 15-year-old teenager. And so it was Jerusalem that became kind of the trigger point for the assault on Gaza. Do you see anything like that on the horizon, Ali, or are we looking at kind of just a continuation of a deadly status quo for, the indefinite future?
Well, I can't read, obviously none of us can predict the future, but here's where I find hope. The way history books were always traditionally written was that history was made by big figures and important people and kings and princes and so on. But what we know, the real history, the people's history, is that history is actually made by movements. It's made by ordinary people. It's made by their struggles and sacrifices. And that's really where I find the hope, because every indication, despite the sort of the horrific actions of these so-called leaders and their collusion and their complicity, all the indications we have is that people are moving in the right direction and pushing in the right direction. And it feels like it's too slow and it's too hard, but it's happening and it's very necessary. And the outpouring of solidarity with the Palestinians was immense in the past week across the region, despite what these Arab rulers were doing. There were huge protests from, Morocco to Tunisia to Jordan, Iraq, all around the world, London, Berlin, Chicago. That solidarity is there. And what has changed in the past decade or so is that the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement has given people a vehicle and a set of tools to turn that solidarity into action. And that is really frightening Israel. That's why Israel has defined the BDS movement as an existential threat. And that's why we're seeing, all of the elites mobilizing everything they can in the form of legislation and so on to try to crush the BDS movement. But there was the report that was leaked and that the Electronic Intifada published in April, the report from the Anti-Defamation League and the Reut Institute, a secret report endorsed by the Israeli government that said that despite spending 20 times more money on trying to thwart the the Palestine solidarity movement in the past 6 years, they have been unable to stop its momentum, unable to stop its, quote, impressive growth and significant successes. So that's where I find a lot of hope. I feel like people are making history, and we just have to push on, even though on some days it feels very exhausting and the progress is too slow. When you step back and look at it from 30,000 feet, it is happening, and we will get there.
Well, on that note, I think that's a great place to conclude our discussion. Was there anything else you wanted to add, Max?
I think we're about out of time. I could keep talking for several more hours, but I think this would be a really good time for some psychedelic NPR jazz.
Well, thank you so much for joining us, Ali. I mean, I think this was a great overview of the many different facets of this, including some that are ignored in mainstream media reports. So thanks again for joining us.
Yeah, thanks so much, Ali.
Thank you. My pleasure. I feel like we only scratched the surface, but you know what? I'll up my Patreon contribution. Maybe you'll have me back.
Yeah, you have to get to platinum Saban level.
Is that like $5 a month?
It's $5 a month. Do we accept food stamps or Bitcoin?
Yeah, no, Bitcoin. Yeah, let's do Bitcoin. We can't have this stuff tracked.
But seriously, I mean, I actually support a bunch of different things on Patreon, and not just through Patreon. I support different independent media because, frankly, this is the only place, podcasts like this, websites like the Electronic Intifada, and other independent media is the only place these discussions are happening. We're not hearing it on MSNBC. So, whatever outlet it is, pick one and chip in.
How can people support the Electronic Intifada?
Well, they can just go to the Electronic Intifada and hit that donate now button. This is the end of the year, and this is the time, everyone's out there trying to raise their money for the next year. But the key point they're making is not a pitch for the Electronic Intifada. It's a pitch to say, if you like and you benefit from independent media, if you have a little bit of extra resources, give it to the ones you like, or even the ones you don't always like, because our society is desperate for political discussion, analysis, and news that is not controlled by Silicon Valley platforms or corporate and U.S. regime media. We need it.
Absolutely, and that's why we've decided to do this show, and everything I do is dedicated to trying to broaden a conversation that has really narrowed, I think, since you and I, and especially, you've been in media even longer than I have, but since any of us have gotten in media, we've witnessed it narrow, even at places that we used to consider to be alternative media like Democracy Now!
Yeah, and I'll tell you, this tells you how old I am, but during the second Intifada, so at the beginning of the 2000s, when that was one of these periods when there was a lot of focus on Palestine, I used to routinely get invited onto MSNBC and CNN and even Fox and others. And that just doesn't happen anymore. It's now a big news if a Palestinian makes it onto CNN or MSNBC. And that narrowing, as you've said, is even hitting, some of the progressive media. So we have to push back against that.
Yeah, you tweeted that you had been invited on Russian media, referring to RT, Qatari media, referring to Al Jazeera, and CBC, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, but no calls from U.S. media. So there you have it. I think that really emphasizes the importance of independent media, and also the need to just ferociously attack the corporate media model.
Well, just, I was called by independent media in the U.S., but not by any of the corporate networks. And again, that's the place where these discussions are happening, and we need to support that.
Indeed. Amen.
Well, you're preaching to the choir here, of course, and I would also invite listeners to support the Electronic Intifada, of course, because you're all doing some of the most important original journalism on a lot of these topics. And of course, we should all in general support independent media, like you said. So thanks a lot again for joining us, Ali. and I'm sure we'll have you on in the future, depending on how much you add to. No, I'm just kidding. We'll definitely have you on again in the future.
Thank you.
NPR Jazz.
Thanks for listening to Moderate Rebels. As always, we will have show notes for our episode, and our website is moderaterebelsradio.com. If you would like to support what we're doing here at Moderate Rebels, and if you'd like to gain access to exclusive content, please consider subscribing at our Patreon page. That is patreon.com/moderaterebels. And of course, we're on social media. We're on Twitter at Moderate Radio, and we're on Facebook at Moderate Rebels Radio. Thanks for listening.